How do you learn from what people are saying? How do you take those lessons and fundamentally change the way you do business to make sure that not only does this never happen again, but you've actually learned from it as a business?
This is the Brave Ideas Podcast, brought to you by Aqua, part of the Wonderman Network. Welcome to episode 42 of the Brave Ideas Podcast, the show that is all about bringing to light fresh perspectives from the world of digital and marketing. I'm Dan Herman. I'm a digital strategist. I'm a two-time Assegai Award winner. And today, I'm here with my co-host.
I'm Esther. I head up Conversation Analytics here at Aqua. I'm a two-time Assegai Award winner. And today, we're here with our guest.
Today, we are really excited to have as our guest Michael Oelschig, Head of Strategy at Cerebra. Mike is a massively jet-lagged cricket fan, and he is the only qualified lawyer working in social media. And he's going to talk to us about how to manage a crisis. Mike, what's new?
How's it, guys? Thanks for having me. I'm here to talk about crisis communication, which is definitely one of the most important topics when it relates to social media of our time. And because of that, we've recently released a handbook around crisis communication. So I'm just here to talk about that and the importance of crisis communication, because it relates to every single business. And no matter what industry you're in, no matter what vertical you're in, no matter how big your company is, crisis communication is massively important. I'll use a clever example, a funny example. So I always say to people, I imagine that there were a couple of dentists sitting in Minnesota and thinking crisis communication. We're a dentist. Why would we ever need to handle a crisis? Until one of their partners went to Zimbabwe and shot Cecil the lion. And all of a sudden, they're the most famous dentist on the planet. And people are just going at them on social media and at their office. And they had to deal with this crisis created, but nothing to do with their business. It had just so happened that one of their partners did something a bit stupid. So it is relevant to every single business.
So Mike, how would you define a crisis?
A crisis is something that negatively affects your business. And I know that's very broad, but crises by definition are very broad. Does it affect your reputation? Does it affect your staff morale? Does it affect your stock price? Anything that can have a negative effect on your business is essentially a crisis.
So what are the different types of crises that can manifest?
Yeah, that's a good point, because everybody treats crises the same and everybody assumes they're the same. And especially when you talk about social media crisis in particular, they think, oh, something's happened on social media. And that's not the case at all. We identify three types of crises, starting with the most talked about, because it happens a lot in our country, is the employee crisis. Is that when an employee says something on social media or sort of in radio, whatever it is, that negatively affects your business. The obvious example is Penny Sparrow. And why that's such a good example is because she worked for Jarvis Properties. But when she said what she said on Facebook, she actually didn't work there anymore. And yet still, people associated what she said to Jarvis Properties, even though she didn't work there anymore. So no matter how much you can say on social, my views are my own or whatever it is, they're really not. People will naturally associate to your business, and a business will have to deal with that. Then there's the marketing crisis. So when a marketing campaign goes wrong, a BIC being the example of that locally. So when they had that Women's Day campaign, that went horribly wrong, that's generally a marketing crisis. And then the most important one, which ironically doesn't get the most attention, is a business crisis. Something fundamentally has gone wrong with how you do business. BP oil spill being one of those. Locally in South Africa, Murray and Roberts was an example when the bridge collapsed. That's something that fundamentally goes to the core of who they are as a business. And as I said, and people don't think about that as much as they think about my employee saying something stupid. So they have a policy in place for the employees, but they don't think about how can something play out if my business goes wrong.
You know, it's a really broad space of crises, and we encounter them. You know, I'm sure as in the kind of space you are in conversation analytics, the impact of crises is very profound on brands. And it's quite interesting to think about it in the context of the social media age that we live in. So what has, in your opinion, been the impact of social media on crisis communication?
It's given people a soapbox. It's given people a voice. And we talk about those kinds of things, not only related to crises, but related to marketing in general. You know, traditionally, when a business had a crisis or something went wrong, what happened was they had a spokesperson, one spokesperson that was paid to be the spokesperson. They had a PR department. So all they really had to do was release a statement, make contact with media guys to get their message out there. So they had the luxury of space and time to deal with it. Whereas now, everybody in the world has a voice. Everybody has an opinion. And social media is real time. So whereas previously you had the space to move, now you have to talk to a lot more people, a lot faster, in real time, deal with a lot of different opinions. And it's just the speed and sheer scope of the communication through social is fundamentally changed.
So how do you do that? How do you practically start managing these types of crises in the social media space?
Prepare. Be prepared beforehand. It's because we found in the survey that we did around businesses, we found that while only 50% of companies have a plan to deal with this or have dealt with a crisis, 80% of companies that have a crisis communication plan have had a crisis before. So it's this weird thing that they wait for it to happen. And once they've had something go wrong, then they go, oh, now we need to have a plan in place, which is quite an interesting dynamic to notice when we survey these guys. So yeah, plan beforehand. It is going to happen to you, whether you're a big business or a small business, something, whether it's tomorrow or in 10 years' time, something is going to go wrong. You're going to have to deal with one of these situations. So prepare beforehand. Don't, because we have clients rushing to us and going, something's going wrong, can you help us? And we've never, ever had a business come to us and go, help us plan before it happens. It's always in the moment. We helped with BIC, we helped with Discovery when they had that fatality points thing. No, none of these businesses have a plan in place to deal with it. They just sort of left scrambling when something goes wrong. So my biggest piece of advice is plan before. Plan as if you're going to have a crisis in a week's time.
What does planning practically look like? It's all fine and well to tell these companies, plan, do it, we'll think about it. But what do they need to be thinking about? And how do you plan for a crisis? You don't know if tomorrow there's going to be a giant oil spill in a country. I mean, is it like a risk analysis? Like, what is the way to start thinking about planning for crises?
Well, the first thing you hit it on the head there is a risk analysis. BP had to know at some point they could potentially have an oil spill. There's many things that can potentially happen with BP. Do a risk analysis. Figure out where you can go wrong, where things can go wrong in your business, and jot them down. Literally think about every single type of situation that could potentially manifest that could create a crisis. And then beyond that, once you've done that, I don't want to go into too much detail, but associate levels of risk. Because not all crises are made the same. Some have a fundamental impact on your share price and can actually collapse your business. Some are just, social media are complaining about you and it dies in 3 days, but it's something you still have to deal with. So associate levels of risk to each of those crises. And then figure out what are you going to do about it. So be practical about it. Pretend it's happening now. Come up with a communication strategy. Who is the spokesperson that is going to deal with this? Who's the direct person? Who are the team members we need to pull in to deal with the social media conversation? So that's it. Audit your risk, associate levels of risk to that, which we call a triage process, and then come up with a communication strategy in each of those. Who's responsible? What are we going to say? Where are we going to say it? The traditional communication strategy is just now associated with the crisis. So yeah, those are the 3 main steps I would advise businesses to take.
I want to take a little bit of a different approach and ask you about the risks involved with not having a comms strategy with regards to crisis. So you're a lawyer yourself, and we've seen social media develop these interesting new spaces for people to say whatever's on their mind or to have arguments, etc., that we're not sure at this stage, like what can be held against you in a court of law type of scenario. Is it that serious? Is not having the right comm strategy as serious as something being held up against you in the court of law? Or what is the implication?
The one is you can prevent a lot. Many crises can be prevented by going through this risk analysis. For example, if you have a proper policy in place for employees' use of social media, you can avoid a lot of employees saying something stupid on social media. So a lot of them you can prevent by going through this process. So that immediately eliminates anything ever happening. But a lot you can't. Things go wrong in any business and you have to deal with it. And a lot of the time, for example, the BP oil spill again, you kind of just have to ride it out. I mean, it's going to have a detrimental effect on your business. You're just going to have to ride it out. But there are many cases where you can mitigate the effect. And I think with Barclays, when it was pulled out with the ABSA example, they mitigated a lot of that because we had a plan in place. Another example I want to use is Marion Roberts. So Marion Roberts were not on social media when the bridge collapsed. So what ended up happening was, because they didn't have a plan in place, because they didn't communicate with people on social media, the narrative that was being generated by people on social was the only narrative out there. And that was they're racist. They used cheap materials. They didn't use the correct bolts. There was a rumor going around at one point. Because the bridge was going to Alex, they didn't really care about the construction. All these narratives were playing out on social media and they didn't have a response to it. Firstly, because they weren't there and they hadn't had a plan in place. So now all that's happened is if you go on social media and you see anything about Marion Roberts, all you're seeing is one side of the story. And that's obviously going to have a reputational effect on the business. Now people associate Marion Roberts with all those things that people were saying and they didn't have a response to it.
I mean, I think that's quite interesting because in a lot of ways, controlling the narrative has become a big theme in kind of the social media world. I mean, there's so many different narratives and people want to believe the narrative that they want to believe. how do you keep your authenticity and not come across as disingenuous?
Yeah, like we now have a very corporate process on how we deal with crisis.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like not come across as disingenuous when trying to shape that narrative in the social media environment. Because on the one hand, the crowd is very damaging, but there's actually something to learn from the crowd, and it maybe is not simply about mitigating damage, but actually taking input in order to enhance and fix your approach.
Sometimes companies do something wrong, and you're wrong.
You're at fault,
and you're wrong. Absolutely.
So how do you kind of balance that? This desire from businesses to kind of, I need to control this narrative because if I don't control the narrative, it's going to hurt me and hurt my business, versus I actually need to come across as an authentic and sensitive brand and talk to consumers who have a perspective that I need to learn from as well. What's the balance?
Absolutely. So the one thing in that situation, when a business has done something wrong, one of the questions we get asked a lot is, do you apologize? Do you go out and apologize? And it's a loaded question because, there's so many variables in place. Sometimes absolutely you should. But I think when a business has fundamentally done something wrong, the idea is not so much in the dealing in the moment. I think the idea is what we call closing the loop. As you rightly say, how do you learn from what people are saying? How do you take those lessons and fundamentally change the way you do business to make sure that not only does this never happen again, but you've actually learned from it as a business? And more importantly, being shown to do that. Show the people that you've made a change. Show the people that you've learned from this and you've changed your product. For example, when I think it was Lewis, when they had that washing machine thing about the poor gardener that bought a 8,000 Rand washing machine and then ended up paying 40,000 Rand for it because of their business practices. That is a business crisis. It goes to the core of their business. Now, if Lewis carried on doing the same thing over and over again, they would have an issue. But I think if they can show that because of this situation, they've changed their policies, they've changed their lending practices, then I think they will come out the other side of it much better. So that's all you can really do. I mean, if you've done something wrong, show that you've learned from it.
Cool. I mean, I think that's a great answer. And another thing that I would like to know is also around the possibilities of being precognitive around potential crises that may emerge. To what extent is kind of data and big data playing a role in helping brands prepare for a crisis?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, we know as social media and digital marketers, we are analyzing conversation all the time. The best thing we can do is identify trends in that conversation. Because a lot of the time people are saying negative things about your brand, but it's not so much that you have to really deal with it. And you can pick those trends out. And I think one of the things we talk about in the book is how to know when something's going wrong is what we call identification planning. Planning to identify when something might go wrong. And that's all about data. That's all about conversation analysis. It's all about trend analysis. So if you've got the processes in place to go, our positive sentiment normally sits at around 8%, our negatives around 10%. Suddenly negatives spiked at 20%, something's going wrong. So that's the way you use data, is to identify when something could potentially go wrong and when it is going wrong. When you see noticeable differences in your trends, in your conversation trends, in your sentiment trends, when suddenly you see a spike in any of those, that's a good way to know when something's going wrong. So it's a very good identification factor, is to use data in real time.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting how agencies could structure themselves to support more of that, and we talk about a lot about command center kind of thinking in terms of, having your finger on the pulse of the trends, of the spikes in conversation. To what extent is Cerebra starting to do that for their clients?
Command centers, we're doing quite a bit of it. I think we've done it for Coca-Cola. We set up what we call a CIC, Customer Interaction Center. And Coke, that actually came from global. Coke was at the forefront of this kind of thinking, but it's happening a lot more locally. We're doing it with Vodacom currently. We're setting up a digital center of excellence for them. We're doing it for Showmax. Same thing, developing. So the idea is to get everybody that has an impact on social media marketing, on social media communication, conversation, whatever it is, in the same room, learning from each other all the time. And then when a crisis happens, it's already set up, because we talk about war rooms in the sense of something's gone wrong, let's put the plan in place, let's set up a war room to deal with the crisis. But if you already have that situation set up, if you already have a CRC or a digital center of excellence in place, then dealing with the crisis becomes that much easier. So a lot of companies are going that way, and I think rightly so.
So Mark, if there was one last thing that you'd like to leave with Wonderman, the network, our network of agencies, and anyone else listening online today, what would it be?
I'm going to cheat and say two. First thing is, so if we're talking to agencies, it's something to advise your clients on. But if we're talking to people in the business space, is don't think it can't happen to you. That's hugely important. It will, at some point, it will happen to you. A crisis can happen and will happen to most businesses in the future. First thing. And then secondly, make sure you prepare for it. Don't deal with only managing a crisis. Don't think how you're going to manage a crisis. Think about before. Plan and prepare so that when a crisis happens, it becomes paint by numbers. Because everything has already been set in stone, everything has already been planned for, so that when it happens, it's a much more fluid and simple process.
Awesome, Mike. Thanks so much for a great conversation. And if people want to find out more about this topic and more about you, what do they need to do?
Probably the easiest thing will be to go into Cerebra's website. So that's cerebra.co.za/resources, and you can find all the information about the handbook there. Or alternatively, you can just email me. That's Mikeo, Mikeo, @cerebra.co.za.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you for listening to the Brave Ideas podcast. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or YouTube. And while you're there, give us a rating and a review.
For more awesome content and to subscribe to our e-newsletter, please visit the Brave Ideas blog, which you can find at aquaonline.com/Brave Ideas podcast. Also, if you want to get involved in the conversation, please follow @Aqua Brave Ideas on Twitter or Brave Ideas Podcast on Instagram.
If you want to keep in touch with me, Dan, you can follow me at elhermo on Twitter and elhermo23 on Snapchat and Instagram. And you can get in touch with Esther.
It's Esther M at aquaonline.com.
Special thank you to Mike Oelschig, our guest. Thanks to Matt Klebanski for engineering and production, and to Matt and Isaac Klebanski for the music. Thanks to Johan Botha for the art direction, and to our distribution team, Akesh Ramsamy, Sabelo Kanyila, Helen Semenis, Simon Vichers, Lennon Mutli, and Matt Black.
That brings us to the end of the show. We'll leave you with one final thought. There are no original ideas, only original people.